หมื่นชีวิตในชนบทคงพึ่งโรงพยาบาลนี้ได้สะพานนี้คงเป็นสะพานต่อชีวิตได้อีกหลายชีวิตและโรงเรียนนี้คงได้เปิดประตูแห่งโอกาสให้กับลูกหลานของเราหากเพียงแค่ไม่มีการทุจริตต่อต้านการทุจริตคอร์รัปชันตั้งแต่วันนี้
คลิปรณรงค์การต่อต้านคอร์รัปชันนะคะในโอกาสที่วันที่ 9 ธันวาคมค่ะเป็นวันต่อต้านคอร์รัปชันสากลนะคะวันนี้ดิฉันได้รับเกียรติจากที่ปรึกษาการต่อต้านคอร์รัปชันระดับภูมิภาคสำนักงานป้องกันยาเสพติดและปราบปรามอาชญากรรมแห่งสหประชาชาติหรือ UNODC นะคะมาพูดคุยถึงแนวทางการแก้ปัญหาและการวางนโยบายในระดับภูมิภาคเพื่อต่อสู้กับคอร์รัปชันค่ะคุณเชอร์วิน มาจเลสซี่ค่ะ We just shown the video clips. What's the point of the clips in campaigning?
Yes, this public service announcement basically I think has the very important message which sometimes may be lost on the broader public of how corruption impacts everyone in the society. You saw a school that disappeared, a hospital that disappeared, a bridge that disappeared to make the point that if there was no corruption, if money wasn't stolen from the public, that money could have been spent on development of the country or countries. So that I think we want to basically raise awareness about the broader impact of corruption, apart from the fact that some people are enriched through this process unfairly or unduly, that it actually affects public in other ways, in very important ways.
The setup of 9th of December as International Anti-Corruption Day, it's been 9 years already. Is today corruption more or less than before?
Yeah, it has been 9 years that this day has been announced, which was the same day that the UN Convention Against Corruption was opened for signature in 2003. It's very tempting, I think, for media and the journalists to look for hard data or information or statistics on the situation of corruption in different countries, and it's very important to have that kind of data, but it's very difficult to have that kind of concrete information, particularly at global level. So
what can you tell us
I think,
as regional advisor?
Yes, in ways we have actually more information that shows how severe this problem is globally, but I mean, I can't really say whether it's less or more than before. We have now data through, for instance, the World Bank Institute that shows each year there is an estimate, a lower estimate of at least $1,000 billion, that's $1 trillion, are paid in bribes globally. Or the Asian Development Bank has some data that around 17% of global GDP or gross domestic product is kind of wasted through corruption. So we have this kind of information, but these are all estimates, and it's it's very difficult to compare this information and say whether it's getting better or worse globally. I think what's very important though is for each country to do these kind of studies, to develop some information to see whether the situation in countries are improving or is getting worse.
And you've been in Thailand, based in Thailand for 15 months, but your role is to inspect corruption all over the region, including 10 members of ASEAN countries. Can you give us a glimpse of corruption trouble in this region?
To be precise, we don't really actually inspect as such. We don't have that kind of role or mandate to inspect what countries are doing, but more to assist or to work with governments to help kind of improve, hopefully, the situation in countries. What I can say about ASEAN is that, of course, ASEAN is a very diverse region, 10 countries with immense potential, but also with lots of, at the same time, similarities and differences in different ways. Out of these 10 countries, 9 have already joined the UN Convention Against Corruption that I referred to earlier, which is a very important global instrument that helps countries fight corruption. The only country which hasn't ratified this convention yet is Myanmar. We are hoping that that will happen in a very near future. And our hope is that by joining this convention, countries are better equipped to fight corruption. So there has been important development in the region in terms of joining this global legal framework. But now I think the big challenge for all of these countries to actually implement their obligations under this convention.
Does it mean with this convention, does it mean UN will have more authority or more command in checking, having checks and balances on corruption in these countries?
Yes, UN as such won't have authority to check, but it actually will have a mandate to work with countries once they join this convention to help them implement these obligations. However, the convention also creates a system of kind of monitoring, but an intergovernmental system of monitoring. What it means is that all countries that have actually joined this convention will have to go through a review of how they have actually performed their obligations. And this system is actually done gradually, so each year a number of countries will be reviewed. Next year, actually, Thailand in 2013, starting around May, June 2013, will be under review to see how they have performed. And that is basically a system where the governments have to do a self-assessment to reflect on how they have done inside the country. And then 2 countries will be selected randomly by draw of lots to actually work with Thailand to review how Thailand has performed its obligations under part of this convention. So that, in that sense, yes, there is some monitoring system that's created.
So far as you have noticed and learned about Thailand's situation, even though you have to study in terms of regional perspective, what do you see as the most serious trouble of corruption in Thailand?
I think there are many issues that affect countries in the region, including Thailand. Countries which are in this kind of transition phase, growing economies and so on. I mean, I'm not informed enough about specific case of Thailand, but I think there are some common themes in countries in the region, including Thailand. When you have this kind of economic growth within a short period of time, it increases the risks, the kind of exposure to questions of corruption. So it's very important to have systems, measures in place to prevent corruption, to kind of reduce the risks, but also to have stronger enforcement in these areas. So I think there is generally risks associated with economic growth at a high speed. There is also issues of related to patronage or conflict of interest that have to be addressed, which is not unique to Thailand, I have to say. Many countries, whether developed or developing countries, deal with these kind of questions. But many of these countries need to actually expand the definition of corruption in their laws to deal with some issues that are more modern or more recent. To deal, for instance, with issues of conflict of interest that are very important, that would affect, that would actually create corruption in many countries.
I'm sure you must have learned or must have been quite familiar with political climate in Thailand, with the deep political division in the country. How do you think you see relevant factor between political division and corruption problem?
Yes, again, in cases, and again, I won't be specifically talking about Thailand, but any country that has kind of political division, and that's normal in any democracy, of course. The risk to avoid is to make the anti-corruption agenda become a political one. Of course, corruption is in some ways a political question. It is sometimes fueled by political interest or politics. But what's important is that the response to corruption should be through rule of law. And rule of law should be basically blind to politics. It should treat everyone equally. That's the basic kind of a premise of rule of law. So that's the most important point, I think, for all countries to make sure that their anti-corruption efforts are based on rule of law and that they are not politicized, because that becomes very dangerous. When it's politicized, then actually it can backfire. It can actually reduce the confidence in the system. So that's a very important element to avoid. And I think there are ways of doing this. There are ways of making sure that there's independence within anti-corruption agencies and so on to avoid politicization of the agenda, of the anti-corruption agenda.
Some respondents say that they are ready to tolerate corruption. How do you see this answer?
I have heard about this survey, of course, several times. I think it's very alarming to hear that. I mean, I don't know about the methodology of the survey and so on, but I think to hear that there is this information that a relatively large number of people or youth, I understand, would accept corruption as long as it leads to economic growth is really worrying. Because I think there is a fallacy in that premise. Corruption would, in the long term, would undermine economic growth. I think that's something that's very well established, that it will lead to weakening the institutions. It will undermine competition, which is very important in a market economy. It would kind of undermine the confidence in the market. So there is no way that it can actually lead to economic growth. And there is, of course, an ethical and moral dimension to the question too.
So people shouldn't tolerate any level of corruption at all?
Certainly not. And not only because of the ethical or moral dimension, but also I think from a very economic standpoint, it's very important to deal with corruption or to suppress corruption, to have more growth, because nowadays also, particularly in an interconnected world, in a world that's economies are connected to each other, so much depends on investment, foreign direct investment and so on. I think it's very important for investors to see an environment which is conducive to fair competition, that there is a level playing field for business and so on. So I think there are all sorts of interest in ensuring that there is clean kind of system or governance in place.
What if ordinary citizen in Thailand see bribe or paying tea money very ordinary, very normal?
Well, I think people should see the longer term interest of the country, of the nation, of the future generations. The way that these practices basically wears off the moral fabric of a society. Because if you accept this, if you continue to accept this, in the longer run, these practices, as you said, become completely normal, and it becomes very difficult to change the attitude of the society. It's very important for people to stand by the right principles and do the right thing. We don't want, of course, to preach people. It's very easy to say the nice words. You need to do different types of activities. You need to take different types of actions parallel to each other to change the attitudes in the society. Of course, you have to have expectation from citizens, but also reforms have to be undertaken from the government side. Actions have to be taken by the private sector, by the civil society. The bottom line is that everyone has to work together towards a common goal, which is to basically prevent corruption and to reduce corruption in the society, but also the common goal of making a better country, a better economy, a better future for the children, and kind of reducing corruption is part of that agenda. But as I said, we can't expect only the citizens to do their part. Everyone has to do something in this.
Who should do first? Business sector, politicians, ordinary people, or civil society?
I think all of these sectors have to work together and parallel to each other. It can't start only from one or other. It's impossible to prioritize between these. I think it should be really what we call a whole of government and society approach.
But we must have wanted real leader in doing this. Who should be the first leader?
Of course, leadership is very important always in any area. But I think it should be both leadership at the society level, but also at individual level. You know, each person has to see their kind of responsibilities vis-à-vis the society, but also the higher levels should see their responsibility vis-à-vis the society, both in terms of their leadership, but as well as their kind of obligations toward the population. I think the notion of social contract, a contract kind of between the society and the government is very important here. The expectation that government and society have from each other in terms of their obligations and duties about it.
Among Asia countries and including ASEAN, when we talk about corruption, which can be role model for other countries, can be Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, or Japan. Why can those countries are so successful, but unlike others? What are the factors?
I think many countries look at a number of success stories. As you mentioned, for instance, in ASEAN, Singapore has relatively a good reputation in dealing with corruption, and indeed they have been seen by many as a model. Hong Kong, another example that you referred to. It's very tempting again to look at role models, but I think also it's very difficult to replicate these models in other places. Think of Singapore, a country of 700 square kilometers with a population of 5 million people, a city-state basically, is drastically different from Thailand, a country of 65 million people, or Indonesia, a country of 240 million people with 1.9 million square kilometers. So it's very difficult to expect to replicate exactly that model in other countries with different backgrounds and much more complex societies. At the same time, I think there are elements that we can see and take from these countries, and that's one thing that we try to do.
Is it necessarily that corruption tends to happen among poorer countries?
Corruption affects all countries, rich or poor. I think our work, our data, our activities show that it's certainly not only limited to poorer countries. I think at all levels of development, countries are affected by corruption. Of course, in situations where economy is weaker, it may have an adverse impact on rule of law in the country for different reasons. But overall, I think corruption, unfortunately, is a phenomenon that you see everywhere in poor and rich countries. And very often, unfortunately, some actors from rich countries, from more developed countries, are involved in corruption in less developed countries. Companies that go and invest in other countries, Western companies, let's say, that do pay bribes to have access to certain markets, or they actually can be actors in corruption in other countries. So there are all sorts of different interaction between rich and poor countries in terms of corruption.
You have involved in UN Oil for Food program in investigation of corruption. What can we learn the most from this program?
I think again, kind of the case confirms the point that corruption has no boundaries. It actually affects both poor and rich countries, and it has that element. This case specifically confirms this element of companies from even countries which have very, very good reputation in terms of anti-corruption. Nordic countries like Denmark or Sweden, their companies would be involved in these anti-corruption cases in other countries. But very importantly, importance of having mechanisms in place in large-scale programs to prevent corruption in the first place, and then very effective law enforcement. Fortunately, now we have a mechanism, at least a global framework, that's this UN Convention Against Corruption, that deals with several elements related to international dimension of corruption.
And why does UN deal with corruption?
Yes, precisely because of this international dimension, because Corruption is a development issue. It undermines development of countries. And development is a very important part of the UN's work. It's a very important pillar of UN's work throughout the world. The other element is that very often, at least in case of grand corruption, there is a financial flow, illicit flow that takes money out of the country. The corrupt kind of proceeds go to other countries, to safe havens, to financial centers. And in order to bring back these proceeds of crime or corruption, you need some international framework to do this. And UN has created this framework to do it through a UN convention, which is now adhered by around 164 countries, as you can see in this map. All the blue parts of the map, so quite a wide coverage that helps countries actually work together better in addressing corruption.
Thank you, Mr. Sherwin Majlesi for joining me.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
เป็นคำยืนยันนะคะจากผู้เชี่ยวชาญนะคะกับการเป็นผู้แนะนำในการวางนโยบายเพื่อต่อต้านคอร์รัปชันในระดับภูมิภาคนะคะว่าปัญหาคอร์รัปชันไม่ควรจะเกิดขึ้นและไม่สามารถที่จะสร้างเศรษฐกิจให้เติบโตนะคะเพราะว่าเมื่อเกิดขึ้นแล้วจะยิ่งทำให้เศรษฐกิจมีแต่ความเสียหายค่ะทั้งหมดคือตอบโจทย์สำหรับคืนนี้ค่ะดิฉันณัฐฐา โกมลวาทินสวัสดีค่ะ